You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's discussion, we're going to talk about CEO succession and ask how should companies and boards of directors prepare for CEO transitions. Joining me today is Blair Jones, the Managing Director of Semler Brossy. Blair, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be with you.
So, Blair, you've been doing this your whole life, it seems like. You've got decades of experience in CEO succession and compensation. Tell us a little bit about Semler Brossy and your experience.
Sure. So Semler Brossy is an executive compensation consulting firm. About 85% of our work is working with compensation committees of boards of directors on issues related to compensation for executives and with human capital management. So more and more of our committees today are human capital committees, and within that remit comes the succession planning charge. And of course, succession planning follows with a number of compensation implications, so we would help the boards think through that as well.
Yeah, so you're an expert on all of these subject matters. Well, you know, as you look at CEO tenure, there are various sources for this. Some say the average tenure is 5 years, some say 6 to 7 years, but you know, it's clearly not, you know, on average 10 or 20. I mean, it's relatively short, you know, given an average 40-year career. How is this trend different today than it has been in the past?
Well, the trend is getting towards shorter tenure, and you're right. There are average statistics and there are median statistics. And I think one study I saw by Equilar showed the median had dropped by 20% in recent years. So there's no doubt that this is a number that's declining. There are a number of reasons for that. One would be this job is hard. There are a lot of external forces working on you, the geopolitical uncertainty that has affected supply chains and, you know, safety of company operations in different places. There's technological change that companies are having to embrace. There are an increasing number of stakeholders. The speed at which information moves has changed. So these are just, they're really, really hard jobs. And then if you think about things, you know, internally that a company's trying to manage, if you're a multinational, you're operating 24/7. You know, you've got workforces of different generations moving at different paces and asking different things. So I think all of that's contributing to a tenure that is declining over time and frankly declining a little faster for smaller companies than for bigger companies. And I guess if you think about that, it makes sense in the sense that with smaller companies, the change can hit them harder. They may not have had the chance to do the kind of planful succession planning that larger companies have the resources to do. And some of them outgrow CEOs over time.
Yeah, and you know, you've got a lot of private equity involvement with smaller companies as well, which, you know, can drive change. But you know, if you think about it, it's just common sense. You know, CEOs prepare typically in their career and they grow into these positions over a 30 or 35-year period. So if people are going into these positions closer to 60 years old than, you know, and retirement age is 65 or, you know, it used to be, I mean, you can kind of see, well, the tenure is just sort of a natural evolution over the life cycle of a career of a business person. So some of that just makes, you know, it's common sense in it. But the point is that it's relatively short, and therefore it just seems like CEOs are getting into the role, really learning what their role is, dealing with, you know, strategic planning, and then poof, you know, boards of directors are always, just almost immediately it feels getting onto having to plan for the successor.
Yeah, I've heard so many discussions and been a part of them over the last few years where the common wisdom now is as soon as you name the new CEO, you need to start the process again. And, you know, some of that is you just don't know what's going to happen either. I mean, you could be hit with an emergency or a crisis that you didn't plan on. You could have an activist in your stock early on. So it's just prudent to be ahead of the process. And also, you just want to make sure that your next cadre is prepared. And there's a lot you can do now working with the search firms and other organizations to do assessments of the skill sets of your candidates for CEO and create developmental experiences that get them that much more ready when the time comes.
Well, there is this whole thing too about internal versus external succession, and I think some of the numbers that you've talked about have shown that, I guess internally, people are succeeding to CEO, what, 70% of the time, 75?
Yeah, in the larger cap companies, it's almost 80%, 77%. It's a little bit lower in the Russell 3000.
And why is that?
I think that, again, you get to this smaller company dynamic where things are changing faster, or companies are outgrowing their CEOs and they need the next generation. I think you're just feeling it more acutely, and there is a little bit of the planfulness that a larger cap company can apply as well.
And then in the larger caps where you're seeing nearly 80% come from inside, why do you think boards are staying inside more for those positions versus an external search?
Yeah, so I mean, if things are going well, you're hugely advantaged with taking an internal successor and enabling them to hit the ground running. They know the company, they know the culture, they have relationships built up both with the employees internally, but with customers and maybe some investors. So all of that allows you to keep a good story going and build upon where you were. Now, there are some internally promoted CEOs who do actually change the game too, that you're bringing them from a business unit, perhaps that you realize because of technological changes or new demands among your customers, that's going to need to be a skill set and have higher prominence in how your company is perceived. So you could actually have a change agent come from inside, but a lot of it's because a company's running well and they just want to continue on.
In fact, boards are seeing that it's actually they're actually getting more and higher quality change from internal candidates than external, because the internal candidates know exactly what's broken, what used to work, what needs to be fixed, where to go, and they are more confident that they can do it on a faster timetable. So there's a lot around that.
You're absolutely right, because if a new CEO comes from the outside, you lose a year as they try to figure out what's going on. They might change out personnel, and my experience would be that not all those new personnel work out. And in fact, they may cause you to lose other key personnel. So there's a lot of growing pains with an external CEO that introduces risk.
Now, another thing that's changed over time are the demographics of CEOs. You know, it wasn't that long ago when I think virtually every CEO was a male. There's been some progress.
Yeah, I think there has. And the latest study that we collaborated on with the conference board would say that the prevalence of female CEOs has gotten to a historical high, in fact, in the S&P 500 at 9.5%, and it's 7.6% in the Russell 3000. And just to give you a sense of movement, in the S&P 500, there were 30 female CEOs in 2017, and now they're closer to 50. And then in the Russell 3000, there were 125 in 2017, and now closer to 225. So, I think that's all good news. A couple of caveats on that. In 2024, when we looked at this sample, almost all of the CEOs hired this year have been at smaller companies, meaning 5 billion in revenue or smaller, so not at your larger cap companies. And to add insult to injury, we've lost 2 highly prominent Fortune 100 CEOs who were females in the last 18 months at Walgreens and CVS. So with the steps forward, there are also a few steps back.
Well, and with tenure, you're gonna, you almost have to do double time in order to do that. So, okay, we made some progress. It went from none to some, but it's still only 10%. And half the people happen to be women. It feels like this is kind of a glacial progress rate here, doesn't it?
It's extremely slow. And I think if you look at it relative to the progress that companies have been able to make with the diversity of their boards and the female representation in their boards, most of the larger cap companies now have 30% representation or higher. So when you look at it with that lens, it feels very far behind, because you
Yeah.
would hope there would be a pull-through effect. And, I think some of that is that, it has to start really, really early, because we need to get more females into operational roles.
But this comes back to the whole question about how boards plan for succession too, because if you say, okay, we really need to start thinking about the diversity of our future leader. And so therefore the pipeline has to be diverse, and we've got to develop women. I mean, it brings boards down further and deeper into the organization from simply focusing on the top job.
That is such a good point, because one of the things that I've observed as we've continued to work with boards and they've transitioned to this human capital committee instead of being a compensation committee is the board might deal with the immediate CEO candidates now, but you have a huge opportunity with the compensation committee to do a couple of things. One, to make sure that the assessment work you're doing and the development work on the current candidates is carried out, because that's hard for a board to keep track of given their agendas. And the second thing is to do exactly what you're saying and reach down and really look at the candidates that are coming up, 2 and 3 levels down, and what's being done from a development standpoint to develop them.
Yeah, and that development can be personal development, leadership development. It could be working with an executive coach, but it also could be an assignment. So if the board says, "Hey, there's a couple candidates here who could be CEO, but we really like to see that person demonstrate this kind of experience, or run the biggest business unit or division, or have international experience," that needs to be long planned. So it goes back to your almost continuous planning for succession, thinking about a 6 or 7 year tenure, or 5 to 7 year tenure, which means it's every board meeting almost that you have to be thinking about it and talking about it, at least in the committee, if not at the full board.
Yeah, I think the committee has been a great place for it, as I've found, in maybe informing the board, just because of the heaviness of the board calendar, and it's been a good way to use them. I would also, call out that it's important to be developing that next level, because if you break trend and you have a CEO that for whatever reason you want to keep on longer than the 6 or 7 years that's average, let's say you have COVID and you keep them on longer, or as the conference board data would show, that there are more CEOs older than age 64 than there have been in a while, you might miss the opportunity with that next level. So with the first set of candidates, so you might actually need to reach to that next level faster than you think.
Yeah, all of these are considerations. And of course, it differs by industry, it differs by company, and the expertise certainly when you're talking about firms that are technical in nature, where their business is technical, or engineering, you have to have people who have experience in those areas. You can't just plug in, somebody with, generic kinds of experience. So all of this is for consideration. One thing you mentioned earlier in the conversation was there are emergencies. I mean, people are people, CEOs are people, they can get sick and so forth. So this notion of having an emergency plan, I guess, is something that's pretty important. Not necessarily just a permanent succession plan, but also somebody who could step in case of illness. Talk about that.
Yeah, and in fact, the emergency successor probably more than half the time is not going to be the permanent successor. What you're hoping is you have somebody who can come in and calm the employee population and bring stability to the investor base as everybody's absorbing whatever this emergency is, whether it's a scandal that's taken place, a health emergency, or a CEO leaving unexpectedly before your succession plan is ready. So there's several elements that you might want to include in this kind of succession plan. The first one is just, what are we going to do the minute that we have an emergency? Who needs to be called together? And what are going to be the roles that we need to call on those people to do? So for instance, the board of director is ultimately going to need to appoint that CEO, and you should have the emergency successor named within this plan. They're going to need to approve the compensation for that individual. They're going to need to think about the communication that needs to happen and what press releases need to go out and approve those. And then they're going to need to talk with the relevant internal and external stakeholders and support the transition as it happens. You're going to have legal counsel that you need, both internal and external legal counsel that's advising you on the compliance with the required disclosures. They're going to support the development of any external communications that you have. And they're going to also help you with the liaison with shareholders and, if relevant, family members. You've got a CHRO who's going to help you both before an emergency happens and through the process with this appointment. You'll need their help because there's a domino effect as you pull somebody up to be the emergency CEO. Maybe they're the CFO. So who's going to be the fill-in for the CFO? And then that has a domino effect throughout the organization. So they're going to need to help you with some of the organizational ramifications and also be part of the discussions about the compensation, working with the outside compensation consultant. They'll also help you with any leadership support activities that happen and help the board with the search for a permanent CEO. And then you've got a whole comms team, a communications team that's going to need to work on supporting this and making sure that analysts and investors and the executive leadership team, employees, any dealers, customers, shareholders and partnerships hear the right messages. They're working on press releases and collaborating with all the other players here. So, when the event happens, you want to have all of that laid out of how the group is going to come together and the decisions that they're going to need to make. Then you'll have a plan for what is the sequence of communications and who's going to take care of all of those conversations. You'll have some ideas if you choose a given emergency successor of other moves that you'll need to make. You'll also have an operating structure that you'll want to think about that will operate in the interim, which might be different from how things operate today. So the executive committee of the board may need to come together in different ways. There may need to be an executive committee among the leadership team. You need risk heavily involved and other councils to support the transition. So the more your board can think through this plan ahead of time, and you may not have thought through every step, but hopefully you've thought through enough steps that if an unfortunate event like this were to happen, you can start without having a blank sheet of paper.
But because of all of these needs and all of these steps, there needs to be a plan, and it needs to be written, it needs to be approved in advance, and actual. It doesn't mean that you can't change your mind depending on the situation, but it has to be worked out in advance, and I think that's your main point.
Yeah, exactly, and reviewed annually because things might change.
We're talking about CEO succession and how boards of directors prepare for it. We're going to take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Blair Jones, the Managing Director of Semler Brossy. Okay, so Blair, before the break, we were talking about emergency succession. There's also, the whole topic of succession, that's not temporary. So, part of that was temporary. What do you do if somebody gets sick, or there's, do you have the CEO, do you have the CFO step in, and for how long? There's also a case where it needs to be, a complete transition. In other words, you need to name a permanent new CEO. Talk about any differences and additions to what you said before the break about a temporary situation in that case.
So what some companies will do is to appoint an interim CEO if they aren't quite ready with their succession planning process, and that can happen for a whole host of reasons, and sometimes it happens in these emergency situations. Then you would appoint somebody to an interim role, and that interim role could be filled by a board member. In fact, the conference board's study that we collaborated on would show that that's the most frequent interim. It could also be a CFO who steps up for a period of time. And this interim leader is being asked to stabilize the organization, perhaps to carry out some tasks that need to happen that make the organization more ready for the next CEO to come on. So it may be that you have gotten yourself into a really tough business situation. The CEO is let go, the board steps in, and the interim CEO takes the time to actually help right-size the organization for you. Or you've had to gotten yourself in a situation where you've had a scandal and there are issues in your financial organization, and the interim can come in. Maybe they're a prior CFO who's on your board, and again, they can help clean up that financial situation with the auditors on an interim basis until you're ready to name a permanent CEO. And then the new CEO doesn't have to come in and fix those situations. Now, sometimes the interim is just because the succession plan isn't ready. So then an interim comes in and they're really just keeping the ship going, making sure customers' needs are met, making sure investors are met with and their needs are heard. And they're just trying to move the organization forward until you can either finish your internal succession planning from a development perspective and get that candidate ready, or bring somebody in from the outside.
Yeah, so in that case, they become a bridge from one to the other. Now,
right.
Another element to this is, again, it comes down to the difference in structure by company. But some companies have a combined chair and CEO. Some have an independent chair. Some have a strong independent lead director, and both. But that is part and parcel to this decision too, both in terms of emergency succession and as well an interim, because if there is an independent chair, that role sometimes can be the bridge and engage more heavily. And also, even in the case of a new CEO or a successor CEO, it's important that a strong lead director or a chair help make that transition and help that new person settle in. So, but talk about the trends here in combined chair and CEO independent lead directors.
Yeah, I'm glad to. So interestingly, the prevalence of independent chairs has risen in the S&P 500. In 2015, there were 30% of companies had independent chairs, and now they've risen to almost 40% of companies have independent chairs, and all companies would have an independent lead director position and role. And sometimes those roles blur because in many cases, the lead independent director has responsibilities that very much mirror what you're expecting from a chair. And as you say, when you have somebody who's brand new to the CEO role, whether they've been hired externally, maybe they were heading a large division of another company, or they've been promoted internally, but they've never been a CEO, an independent chair can provide the cover of running the board while the new CEO is really learning the organization and learning the new role. And they can also provide coaching to the new CEO. certainly perform a governance role with the board of making sure that everything is running well from a governance perspective, and that the board has an independent voice. That would be particularly important on the governance end if you've had a scandal or an underperforming CEO that the board feels like it can weigh in.
Now, we talked about women in CEO positions, and that's approaching 10% in Fortune 500 companies. But one of the trends that really is disturbing to me is the number of disproportionate attacks by activists on women CEOs. Talk about that.
Yeah, it's really an unfortunate trend that's happening. I've had the experience of working with a number of female CEOs, and before I saw the research on this, I was noticing that they were getting some extra scrutiny and extra criticism that some of their male counterparts were not getting in equal measure. And I think as I've watched it more and also looked at the research in it, we still have a barrier to overcome with gender stereotypes. There's just some of the research has very compellingly shown that we still, as a society or as a U.S. Business community, sometimes have a hard time seeing women as leaders or top leaders of an organization. The other thing that comes into play is that women, again, from a gender stereotype basis, tend to have more orientation to building relationships and having open communication and cooperating. So there's been good research showing that both among activists and hedge funds, that they've tended to target females because they can make more progress with those individuals. But the unfortunate thing is sometimes what happens is the CEOs end up working themselves out of a job as they try to cooperate. And one of the most fascinating things that has come out of the research is that when a female tries to take a position that's counter to the gender stereotype and would try to be a little bit more aggressive or a little bit less cooperative, that's actually received very poorly by the activist, and they dig in harder, whereas they expect the male counterparts in the CEO role to be aggressive and to push back and actually look less favorably on the men who would be more cooperative and more communicative. So it's a little bit of a double standard that's hard to observe and hard to see the impact of.
But this says that the boards of directors really need to step up here and not allow their CEOs to be vulnerable in this situation, stand behind the CEO, and maybe the lead independent director or an independent chair needs to step in and play a more combative role if getting attacked from the outside. I mean, we just can't have this. You're not going to make progress towards more gender diversity and diversity of all types in the lead role if that person is just going to get attacked the minute she arrives. So
no, you're right. It's so important for people to see those successes and to see those women supported rather than see boards confounded by what to do the minute an activist comes in.
Yeah.
And I guess I would all argue for getting ahead of activists and trying to make sure they don't come into your stock to begin with.
Well, and make sure the company's performing and all those kinds of things, which you normally would do. So last topic is CEO compensation. And gosh, we could talk all day on this and not to get into the stats and everything, but just give some headlines on trends in CEO compensation.
Sure. So coming out of the pandemic, we've actually seen CEO pay rise quite significantly. And there are lots of different reasons for that. There was a sense that while the war for talent and the Great Resignation was really about the broader population, there was some flow upwards to the leadership ranks, and that included CEOs. Pay was held back in the pandemic, whether the conference board did some great research showing that CEOs actually took cuts in pay at the beginning of the pandemic. We also saw incentives not paying out as much. So there's been a little bit of catch up, to be honest, over the last few years. I think the most interesting thing that's happening right now is a discussion among investors about what they want CEO pay to look like. The most recent proxy advisor survey included a question that was questioning whether the standard model of including 50% performance shares for not just CEOs, but executive leaders was the right way to go. And while the data they got back was a little bit mixed, I think it does raise the question about whether the standard model is right for everyone and whether companies should take the time to determine what pay design will best help them move their strategy forward.
Yeah, but and you have to remember there's been 25% inflation over the past few years overall. So there's some of it is that, but it's typically 90% performance-based pay of some sort. Stock-based and 10% fixed or 10% cash. So you have a bonus. Companies are performing better, bonuses are higher. You have stocks that have rebounded, their values look bigger, particularly when you're trying to use a Black-Scholes model in a comp table. So there are a lot of explanations for this, and some of it's real, but a lot of it is not real and it's not sustainable. So these trends kind of come and go. But it is interesting how it appears that CEO pay has gone up, and we'll see if that holds, right?
Well, yeah, and we already see it slowing down a little bit. I think what's important for boards is to look at how the pay and performance is aligning and making sure that that alignment is something that makes sense over a period of time.
Yeah.
And as long as it does, then that's good. It's
and use those peer groups, because your management can move, and everybody's recruiting, particularly with a 6-year tenure. So good CEOs are always being hunted, and so you got to look at the peer groups and make sure that you're being consistent within those groups.
That's absolutely right, and it makes sense to spend time to determine who the right peers are for those comparisons. And I think it's hard for companies sometimes if they have peers that are a lot bigger than them or a lot smaller than them, because it doesn't fit into our model very well. But those peers can be watched as well. You just watch them below the line for additional trends.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Blair Jones, thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Steve. It was a great conversation.
So Blair Jones of Semler Brossy, a great executive compensation firm. If you're on a board of directors, check in with Blair. And thanks to all of you for listening to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.